Hello and welcome to the special CNBC Africa broadcast. I'm Nozi Pombanjwa. We're breaking away from normal programming to bring you this live conversation from the Nedbank Group's headquarters here in Johannesburg, South Africa. And underlying this conversation is a partnership between the Nedbank Group and the Mandela Institute for Development Studies. These two partners have come together to explore the investment in leadership development in the African continent with the hope of accelerating the journey towards economic integration and social cohesion. Now, remember, before I introduce my panelists to you, if you would like to be a part of this conversation, all you need to do is tweet us. The hashtag is Young Minds Lead Africa, Young Minds Lead Africa. We would love to hear what you think of the insights that are going to be surfaced here today. Now, that being said, I'd like to introduce the founder and the executive chair of Minds, Dr. Nkosana Moyo, who sits closest to me. And next to Dr. Moyo is Mr. Francis Daniels. Mr. Daniels is the director of Africa Opportunity Partners. He is also an advisory board member that sits at Minds. And next to Mr. Daniels is Ms. Zamafuze Ngobo. Zamafuze Ngobo is a Mandela Rhodes Fellow. She's also a leadership development consultant at Minds. And last but not least, we're joined by Victor Khumeswane, who is the author of the well-known publication, Africa is Open for Business. Thank you for making the time to join us. Now, Dr. Moyo, let's start off with the problem that Minds is solving for, or the opportunity that Minds is pursuing. Others call it a leadership crisis on the continent. How do you frame it?
Well, I frame it the same way, that we need to recognize that our continent is not delivering to its citizens in terms of changing the quality of their lives. But we want also to shift slightly how the issue of leadership is framed. We want, especially young people, to take ownership of the challenge as opposed to delegating it to somebody else, whether it's on a generational basis or on a sector basis, politics versus whatever else we might be doing. We're saying all of us are leaders. All of us actually ought to develop a view on where we want either our countries or the continent to be, let's say, 10, 20, 30 years from now. Once we've developed that view of where we want our countries or the continent to go, we then have to take ownership of creating that reality, all of us. So there is, I think, a crisis of leadership at two different levels. Those who are in leadership positions are not performing, but I think the rest of us are also not recognizing that we are leaders in our own right.
Right.
And we therefore not taking on the responsibility that goes with being a leader.
So two clear areas that you're seeing, performance and almost a sense of agency in terms of leadership in ourselves on the continent. Let me test that with you, Francis. Is there a leadership crisis on the continent? And are you sold on the idea that academically investing in young people is the most effective way that this leadership crisis can be solved?
I reached the conclusion that there is a leadership crisis, although you must know that we have to define crisis for what. What do we mean by crisis? And it seems to me that the measure of leadership has to be how the ordinary people in any particular given country are doing in terms of their life, in terms of their chances. And I think by that measure, although Africa actually started at a lower point than many other continents, with a few exceptions which were ahead, we are definitely not where we want to be. Ultimately, we have to ask ourselves as Africans, are we happy with where we are? And I think on that, there's an unequivocal answer that we are unhappy. And therefore, the leaders are in crisis insofar as they have presided over that. To the question whether it is worth investing, I think the way I look at it is if you ask yourself, what is the greatest possible return you can get? You have to say that multiplying the quality of our neurons in our minds so that Today, I think of somebody who at age 5 knows that 2 and 2 is 4. But if you get that person to be able to do geometry and algebra, okay, the amount of money it takes to do that is minuscule in comparison to what the person can do with that knowledge and what the alternative investments can be. So I think, for me, it is self-evident that if we have a crisis, we have to focus on improving the educational opportunities of the young people who, in fact, are the victims and at the same time, the agents of solving the crisis.
So am I hearing you saying that the likelihood of increasing and higher returns on investing in people are much better than traditional assets?
Totally. Absolutely, absolutely the case. If you look at a country like Japan versus a country like Singapore versus a country like South Africa, okay? Singapore is the least endowed. Japan these days is not very well endowed. But you know something? They sell more things than we do sitting here in South Africa with our platinum, with our gold, with our steel and the like. What is their secret sauce? What is their catalyst? The catalyst is the quality of their minds and the quality of their education that their people are endowed with.
So, Zamafuza, you have a unique contribution to this conversation as a beneficiary of the Mandela Rhodes Scholarship, Chevening Scholarship. You have been in the leadership development space as a young leader being developed, and now you sit on the other side of the table putting together models to develop other young leaders. Do these fellowships, programs, models work?
That's a very good question. And you're very right, I'm a product of leadership development programs. And hence I believe in the possibilities that they create, right? To your question, do they really work? I think the first thing is it begins with the intention of the individuals who go through the programs, right? And hence for a scholarship like the Mind Scholarship, it's quite important how we think about the selection criteria of the people coming in, right? And then we think more concertedly as well about what does a Mind Scholar look like at the end of the program, and how do we start to design the right type of experiences, exposure, and support to be able to thrust them into this, profile that we believe, we can contribute in creating for the continent.
And I'll come back to the particular model that's being used, because others would say, well, why be different from tapping into the Ivy League universities, or why be different and not take a regional approach, or even an in-country approach? So I'll come back to that. But Victor, you have scoured and crisscrossed the African continent looking at the way we do business. And one of the things that then fits into this conversation, do you believe that if there is indeed higher outcomes in leadership development, that is what's going to bring us towards economic integration? That is what's going to deliver social cohesion?
Provided the education is practical, provided the education and leadership development links to the realities of the labor market, links to the realities of the economic development. Because remember, it's not Africa that's having a crisis. The world has a crisis. Look at the US, the kind of leadership they have there, how they got there. Look at the UK, look at Europe. Just about everywhere, whether you go to Russia. And it's not that the people are not intelligent, it's because the world has changed so much and we were not paying attention. So if we want to develop leaders in Africa, not only do we have to respond to the unique needs of Africa, which is an underdeveloped region relative to what it has, where it could have been, and where countries with much less have advanced, but we also have to acknowledge that we are in this fourth industrial revolution, where political borders don't matter as much as they used to 50 years ago, where information drives more power, where individual decision-making has control, where investment tends to determine what we do. Investors are more powerful than politicians. And if you have the right infrastructure, you tend to be more attractive than if you have minerals, because people want to know what you can deliver in impact, not just in what you have. So yes, it will if we are responsive to the real world.
I would like to bring up the Kigali voice because the founder of Kigali University really speaks to the issue of a leadership crisis. But let's not forget what the Dean of Lagos Business School has raised, and that filters into the conversation now, and that is around values-based leadership as being the starting point if we're going to be investing in any type of leadership development. So let's bring up the voice from East Africa to tie down the thread on whether there is a leadership crisis on the continent or not.
Well, I mean, not call it leadership crisis because a crisis is always it's a strong word. There could be challenges in leadership, challenges emanating from either the capacity of leadership on a continent or even the methodology or the approach to leadership, because leadership is about results. Leadership is about empowering people. Leadership is about guiding people and moving with them to achieve a given end. So I think I will not call it a crisis. I may call it maybe an issue of the way we are having our leaders accountable, and of course even the leaders being self-accountable to themselves and to the led, so that we get to a given end, which of course is the development at the end of the day. There's of course an issue of training leaders and maybe also empowering them to do the right things in Africa. They say leaders are born, but I also believe that leaders can be modeled, or can be made, or can be guided to be leaders, especially so if they want to be. I think the problem is one is to want to be a leader, and then the other problem is to be a leader. So the two have to be in place, and then guiding the people to do the right thing. Sometimes imagine that somebody is born and then is given a position, he can do the right thing. People have to be coached either by telling them what to do right, or even through experience of doing the same over some time, and then the person put in place do the right thing. But at the end of the day, I think there should be a will and willing to do the right thing. That's the bottom line, to empower people, to make sure that they are doing the best for the people and their countries, and indeed show that they are doing the same, not just wishing to do, but doing the same. Most times people wish to do, or most times people promise to do, but they do the contrary, and that's a problem.
Dr. Moria, lots being said by Professor Nshuti there around the ability and the probability of whether leaders can be crafted or not. But I'm going to quote something that I've heard that you've said in a number of platforms. And you've said that a good idea executed badly makes it seem as if the idea itself was bad in the first place. Now, let's take that quote and link it back to the ambition that's being put here on the table. 57 universities, 29 countries. The question I want to pose to you is, do Africans want to study in Africa?
Do Africans want to study in Africa? But very valid question. But I would rather maybe get us to ask a different question. What are we trying to solve?
Right.
Because I would accept to you that maybe we've come out with the wrong tool for the job that needs to be done. So let's agree first on what is the job that needs to be done. What is the challenge? What is the problem we're trying to solve? We've got a continent which I think by all measures, by most measures will agree, is not in a place where it should be. And what is fascinating for me is that in our history, though, we've been confronted by certain challenges, especially decolonization, which we fought successfully, and there is a particular model that we used. And that model was to use the superiority of numbers, cohesion, partnership, and we tackled that problem literally as a continent, not as individual countries. And what is also fascinating is that as each country got its independence, it didn't then opt out of the rest of the struggle. It stayed with the struggle until 94, i.e. with South Africa. I think there is something to which we can learn from that. What is also challenging for me is to then ask the question, but why is it with that experience, when we see we've got undesirable circumstances on the continent, quality of life that is going the wrong way for our citizens, what is it that we could do? What tools would we need to reverse that?
Yeah.
Then we look at the dynamics of the rest of the world, how it's configuring its efforts to address exactly the same challenges. And I think we need to look at our history, look at all the other people's experiences, compare the two, and see what we can learn from to tackle the problem which confronts us, i.e. changing the quality of lives of our citizens. The world is a competitive place. So if we're looking at economic development, we need to understand that we need to find tools which make our economies or our economy competitive within the global context. How has everybody else done it?
Yeah.
I'm not an economist by training, I'm a physicist. But there's few things that I've understood. And is that when you're producing things, the more things you produce for a given investment, the lower the cost per unit of what you're producing. So scale matters in terms of becoming more economically viable. So we as a continent surely must recognize that if we're competing with, let's say, countries like India and China, which we quote very glibly very often, we're talking about comparing a land mass, comparing the total population sizes of these land masses. But as I've observed, very little else is common. We then get very balkanized. We've got countries with a few million people compared to the other areas with 1 billion people, market size-wise, investment-wise, attractiveness of doing business in those places. We just don't get a look in. So I think if we begin to frame the challenge appropriately, then we get to an answer which says, let's look for the tools that help us to develop management or leadership across the board, political, economic, and otherwise, which allows us to solve this problem. So your question was, do students want to study in Africa? I would say if working on the African continent as a manager begins to give returns for how I invested in my education, the answer is absolutely yes. I have to perceive benefits in doing it, then I'll invest in it. Incidentally, just to make clear, mine is not pretending that studying in Africa precludes exposure to the outside world.
Absolutely.
Not at all.
So I'm going to create a space for Francis to jump in here, because I think we are in a unique place today. We're at the headquarters of a company that has a very ambitious continental business objective. And if we're talking about changing perceptions and mindsets from the perspective of young people who are actually the beneficiaries of leadership development, surely private sector as well must begin to understand the value and appreciate the value of a young person educated in Africa, and who has an education that has both continental value as well as global value. What needs to be true for that to come about?
What needs to be true for the private sector to so appreciate? I think the first thing actually is to look at some of the successful people in Africa. Why don't we start with Mr. Dangote, a Nigerian gentleman of note. He got his university education in Egypt and followed up with a master's degree, I believe, in Sudan. Okay? Thereupon, he set out as a trader, selling goods and services which were imported to Nigerians. He has the distinction of being one of the few Nigerian wealthy people whose fortune was not grounded and founded in the oil sector. I'd like to suggest that emulating Mr. Dangote might be one of the smarter things an African might do. Now, behind that lies a whole panoply of similar people. Let me start with the South Africans in the struggle era. There were many people who left South Africa and got education in countries like Nigeria, countries like Ghana. In fact, when I was a student in Ghana, my first exposure to a South African individual was as a fellow student, admittedly in a drinking bar, but that is not something to be emulated. But what happens from that? What happens from that is that different Africans get to see the granular detail of different African existences. And that is important because Africa is balkanized. Why should a business care? Why do I care as an investor? The reason I care is because the growth of African companies, Pan-African companies, lowers the cost of capital, integrates African markets, and makes it quicker and more profitable for Africa to grow. And it's impossible to do that without Africans who know Africa. I understand that they might know South Africa, or in my case, I might know Ghana, or someone knows Zimbabwe. But if you look in a lot of companies, what you'll see is that the more successful ones in an MTN will take a Zimbabwean and have the person in Nigeria, okay? They will take someone from one part because the person has got experience in another place. I have a friend who is a Ghanaian who worked in EcoBank, and she was in charge of Sierra Leone and eventually went to Angola. If she had had the education in Africa outside her own country, that would make the career path more attractive and more useful to the employer. So I think that if we want to have one Africa, we need Africans who understand each other, not just at the level of watching Nollywood movies, but also at the level of actual experiences.
We've heard some bits and pieces, Mafuze, around the kind of leader that we are trying to co-create, or Minds and Nedbank is trying to create the space to emerge. We've heard from the dean of the business school in Lagos talking about values-based leadership. I think ethical leadership, inspirational leadership is some of the nuggets that we heard from Mike Brown when he spoke earlier. The model that Minds has put together must be, of course, framed around producing a particular kind of leader. What does that leader look like?
So, Nozipo, firstly, I want to slightly backtrack and say, you know, the point where we're still having these types of conversations is slightly problematic, where we have to build a case for why Africans need to study in Africa, right? And I think that part of what Minds is trying to do is challenge that kind of narrative, to say, how do we start imagining or creating people who can start imagining a different Africa, a different space of possibilities and opportunities, right? But more importantly, to the question that you're posing, part of how we thought about designing the leadership element was to firstly consult with a number of individuals and people who have had, you know, experiences on the continent and off the continent through scholarships, through fellowships, etc. And there were a lot of insights that we're able to gather from that. And with that, together with the ambitions of Minds, what we were able to define in terms of what you ask about is, you know, the profile of a Minds scholar. There are three things that I want to highlight. Of course, the first is that, you know, a Minds scholar is exceptional, astute, and apt in their area of discipline. I mean, that is a basic requirement, right? The other two are very important because they make this program uniquely different from me going to study at a Harvard, for instance. Right? So the first is a Pan-African mindset. So how do we give our scholars the right opportunities and exposure to be able to immerse themselves in countries outside of their own, where they can, you know, foster and promote a spirit of greater cohesion and collaboration? The second is based on a pro-African mindset. So how do we get our young leaders to start thinking and believing that Africa's solutions rest on the innovations, the imaginations, and the ideas that are fostered within the continent, and believe in the promise and potential of Africa? So those are the three, I would say, holistic elements in terms of how do we look at that. Okay.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to give you a moment in a second before we go to Edbeck. So Dr. Moyo, very quickly.
Yeah, because I just want to add to this. Part of our challenge as a continent is that we use phrases. We use phrases like servant leadership. But what does that really mean? What is the difference between servant leadership and what I'd actually call rulership, not leadership, that we experience every day?
Yeah.
I think the concept of servant leadership, within it, I think implies that you are mindful and you are sensitive to actually identifying the needs of the community that you are supposed to serve. You need to understand what are their needs, because you can't serve them if you're imposing your perception. You have to listen to them, you have to observe. By taking Africans into different communities other than their own, different countries, we are helping them to develop the skills which lead, I believe, into servant leadership mindsets. Because when I go to Nigeria, just survival alone means I need to be much more observant about what is it going to take for me to survive in that environment. I have to understand Nigerians in order to survive and thrive in that environment. So already it's almost like get our students to live through the concepts rather than theorize about the concepts.
Right.
Take them to those countries and let them live through these things. And from a corporate side point of view, understanding your market rather than being product fixated makes you develop the appropriate product for the community.
So Victor's nodding because I think you are now firmly speaking his language in terms of understanding the fabric of the market. Let me put this in a question, bringing it from Dr. Moyo just before we go to break. Will a deeper understanding of our markets and a greater integration into the communities within which we operate make Africa more competitive and more relevant in global supply chains?
What else is there? I mean, how can you find solutions for Africa that you don't understand, that you're patronizing towards? And it pains me because the very solutions sometimes we call African, like M-Pesa, M-Copper, Solar, are not even driven by Africans. They are driven by M-Copper Solar. It's driven by an American from Minnesota who moved his family to Kenya because he saw an opportunity to sell prepaid electricity using M-Pesa technology, which is also a British technology adopted in Kenya to address the lack of banking. Where are the Africans? They're trying to go to Harvard. They're trying to go to Oxford. And I say, well, what are you doing? Hugh Masekela will tell you this. Ask him. He went to New York trying to emulate Miles Davis and Dizzy Gillespie, great trumpeters. And luckily, he met them. And he says the best advice Dizzy Gillespie gave him was, Hugh, this is New York. You are taking on Miles and me in our home turf. You're going to lose. Take some of the stuff you have from Africa, mix it up a little bit, people will love it. We're talking 50 years ago he got that advice. He's been a great ambassador of this continent. It's only when you know what you have that you can develop it. Otherwise, somebody will take it, like they've been taking it all these years.
And on that note, it's only when you know what you have that you can develop it. We're going to take a short ad break. When we come back, we're going to allow our live audience here in Johannesburg to contribute to this conversation. Remember that if you would like to contribute as well, the hashtag is Young Minds Lead Africa. Send us your tweets and we might be able to pull one or two of your questions into the discussion. We'll see you in 2 minutes. Welcome back to the special CNBC Africa broadcast. We're coming to you live from the Nedbank Group headquarters here in Johannesburg, South Africa. If you've just joined us, we are having a dynamic conversation that is exploring the importance of investing in leadership development if we're going to accelerate the pace towards economic integration and social cohesion. We're about to bring in the voices of our live audience now. We have their own questions, comments, and experiences that they would like to pepper into this conversation. We start with a question from Dr. Terence Sibiya. Terence, please go ahead.
Thank you, Nozipo. My question to the panel is, what is, in your opinion, the biggest issue holding Africa from developing as fast as other countries which may have also suffered colonialism in the past?
Thank you very much. That's our first question, clear and sharp. May I get a hand of where my second question is coming from, please? Please, there's a question right here. Madam, please, won't you stand and ask your question? Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to greet everybody. My name is Singobile Ndebele, and I would like to actually say that I'm glad that we're taking initiative without pointing any fingers at the moment. And I would like Mr. Moyo to please give us short and medium and long-term goals that you guys have as mindset in taking this initiative in claiming back what is rightfully ours and developing our leaders.
Thank you very much, Singobile. And let's take the third and the fourth question. Please, can you put up your hand so we can see you once again? And very quickly move the microphone across. Thank you. Please keep your hand up, sir, so that we know exactly where you are. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Itumeleng, and I just want to ask Mr. Moyo a question about what he said earlier. You said the youth are in the majority, and if they use that lever to their advantage, they'd be able to make a lot of changes for our continent. My question is, what do you think is preventing the youth from taking that lever and using that advantage?
Itumeleng, thank you very much. There's a question behind Itumeleng for the final question in this round. Please put up your hand so that we can see exactly where you are. Thank you very much, sir. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Kambidi Mawotela. I think mine is more of a comment which I would like the panel to reflect on. It seems people end up in two parts of life. It's either in business or in private. Why can't we introduce public and business management away from primary school? The second one actually talks to, you see that the countries that we are mentioning, India and China, one of their outstanding aspect is cultural development, which we are totally ignoring on this continent. Could you please make a comment on that in terms of leadership?
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahotela. So a number of questions that's being posed, but Dr. Moyo, some of them squarely at your feet. So let's maybe start off with Singobile's question. Short, medium, long-term goals, what does the strategy look like?
Okay, so my view would be that we seem not to understand fundamental what influences people either to have confidence or not to have confidence. It's something I've thought about long and hard, and I think so sometimes I'm going to almost sound like I'm contradicting myself in terms of the program, but that's okay. You know, I've got a mother who can hardly read, but my mother is one of the smartest people I've ever met. Yeah. So I don't think education in itself necessarily is the sine qua non. But I think what we need to understand is that when you've got young people growing up, they absorb, often inadvertently, what is going on around them. And if what is going on around them appears attractive, they will internalize it and replicate it even without realizing that they're doing so. If what is around them is repulsive, I use that word, and appears not to lead to a successful future for them, then they will be alienated from it. Again, subconsciously, what am I getting at? So when you look at the African continent, especially post-colonial era, what we've done, we've built the wrong role modeling. We've taken people without skills and put them in charge of operations of all sorts of organizations. And as a result, what young people grow up seeing is failing institutions.
Right.
Institutions that are not being run successfully. And I think it's almost like inbuilt in all of us to want to succeed, to be proud of success and identify with success. When you observe whether it's football teams, whatever teams you see, when a national team is successful, we all feel proud. We want to identify with it. So, but when they are losing all the time, who wants to identify with that? You want to distance yourself away from it. So it's important for us to understand that the more successes we let people experience within their environment, the more positively they're going to feel about that environment. So it may not be such an obvious thing, but every time we put somebody who is incapable of doing a job in a job, not only are we sacrificing that entity, because its future clearly is jeopardized, we are actually undermining the confidence of all of the observers who would normally otherwise identify with that environment. And they want to go away from it. So I would say one of the most immediate things for Africa to do is to make sure that we build role models of successful enterprise run by people that our youngsters or young generation can identify with.
Yeah.
If you can do this and do it well, it means so can I. Young people tend to learn from each other like that. I mean, I've seen it like in simple things like swimming. A child observing another child swim wants to swim and has got confidence they can do it more than when an adult is telling them to swim.
Yes.
They just say, if you can do it and you are my age group, I can identify with you. If you can do it, it means it's doable. I can do it too. So we just really need to understand, build success will give us confidence to do more things with confidence.
Right. I'm going to come and link that back to Itumeleng's question around what is holding young people back. But Victor, I want to just allow you to weigh in on this. I'm almost hearing that investing in the institutions in the public space, and even if we think about state-owned enterprises, which kind of straddle the public and the private space for the most part, is perhaps one of the key ways that we begin to pivot role modeling so that it has a positive ripple effect in the African continent. Where does the story lie around investing in institutions, especially from the perspective that Dr. Moyo has just explained?
The power of institutions is that it takes the power away from individuals, so greedy people can't manipulate them. Because remember, you're strengthening the system, not giving power to individuals. So there's always power in that. When the institutions are weak, people take advantage because there's always going to be a leader. A leader in good or bad times will take advantage of a vacuum. So by strengthening institutions which are not easy to privatize, you are strengthening society. And you also make young people believe in their own civil service. At the moment, well, I'm a teacher who left teaching because I looked around and I thought, I don't think I'm going to do anything here. Besides, I'm not getting paid for it, so let me run. But if you look at countries that have taken teaching seriously and have invested in the institutions, they do a lot better. They end up selling their education. And so I think the power of institutions is that it takes away the manipulation, the risk of being manipulated from corrupt people. And people remember what the system is. Once you have strengthened systems and processes, people worship them and they can pass them on to the next generation. But if I'm leading this institution, I'm running it my way, even if I'm good, when I leave, it collapses.
Right. So and that links back, and Francis, I want to bring you here because Mr. Motela raised more of a comment around the integration and the merging of public and private management, or public management and business management, as he calls it, and almost not having this distinction, for example, of public administration studies and an MBA to simplify it, and maybe having an integrated focus that allows for the basic management principles to spill over onto both sides. What's your reaction to that comment?
I am skeptical that one should treat the management principles as equally applicable to the public and private spheres. It seems to, and the reason is that the public sphere has an additional difficulty over the private sphere. And that additional difficulty is that people in the public sphere, all of us being self-interested creatures, have responsibility not for themselves, but for everyone. Whereas in the private sphere, you have responsibility essentially for yourself. And it takes a great deal of education and experience and instruction to learn how to balance self-interest with a perspective of considering the interests of all. If you look at the countries which have been successful in uplifting their people, and for me, people who know me know that Singapore will come first in mind. you'll find that they have schools of public policy for instructing their class of public servants in how to do their jobs properly. So I think that where I am in sympathy with the view is that I detect in the view a desire for symbiosis and cooperation between the public and private sphere. And I think that is a tragedy that in Africa we tend to feel that the public and the private are enemies rather than collaborators. But we must be careful not to think that just because they're collaborators, they're identical, and that the skill sets required for them are identical. In my view, they are not.
You know, I hadn't thought about this, but this country, for instance, Francis, I think, put something very important on the table. Unless I misunderstand, the understanding I have is that if you look at DGs, for instance, in this country, they're on term contracts. And a lot of them, those I've known, let's say, in the last 10 years, 15 years or so, appear to have migrated from the public sector into the private sector. It's almost like there is a system that has been set up for them to know they are on a journey to somewhere else as opposed to staying, creating public goods.
Yeah.
And so then you ask yourself, so as they do their job, where is their focus?
Yeah.
Are they preparing grounds for their future careers in the private sector, and what effect does that have on how they perform their job today?
I think that's an amazing point of a conversation that we could probably have for another hour or so. So I'm going to come back to the question around restraints. There are two questions around restraints. I'm going to ask you to comment on that, and I'd like Zamafuza's view on it as well, Dr. Moyo. The first question around restraints was Itumeleng, a young person who feels stepped on by your earlier comments about young people being responsible for everything that is going wrong in our different markets. And he says, please help me understand, in your view, what do you think is the thing that's preventing young people from exercising agency, if I can put it like that? But maybe also link back to Dr. Sbia's question around, well, what is keeping Africa from realizing its full potential when there are other parts of the world where that were colonized as well?
You know, firstly, I want to make sure that we understand each other. The way I function is that I observe the facts. I'm not judgmental. I try to interpret them as objectively as possible. So it's not a question of saying it's good or bad or whatever. I want to understand what are the facts, what has led to those facts, and what needs to be changed. I want to identify two things that I think contribute, and I'm not going to pretend these are the only two things. Our African societies generally are both hierarchical and ageist. And I think that's an element which takes away from young people being agents much more proactively. That's one thing. The second one, I think, is actually negative role modeling. Our continent is full of people who've made money and therefore on the surface have improved the quality of their lives by doing the wrong things. And I think a lot of young people are seduced by the end result, i.e. a good life, and they start looking at the role models, i.e. what was the path followed to end up in this place. So instead of focusing on creating a different world that would work more acceptably for everybody, they start focusing on these, what appears to be the wrong models, role models, successes, where money has been stolen, shortcuts have been taken, and so on and so on. In the short term, it feeds the families of these people that appear to have made a lot of money. And I think a lot of young people, unfortunately, are seduced by that. So I would identify those two as contributing to the challenge.
And on the broader question of markets and countries that have been colonized, what is the restraint that has still made African markets not truly able to break free from those constraints?
So let me answer your question indirectly. Who asked the question, by the way, about why the success of...
Right in the front.
Yeah, so I think, let me tell you, I've worked in the UK for British companies, and I always challenged my colleagues because there was a phenomenon which I found fascinating. So if a British manager was being sent, let's say, to India, China, Japan, they would go through a program of sensitizing them in terms of how to go and behave and do business over there. The only place that where this didn't happen was anybody being sent to the African continent. Yeah? It's fascinating. What does it tell us? What it tells me is that Africa continues to allow, because I think the fault is on both sides, Africa continues to allow itself to conduct its business on the basis of being non-African. We pride ourselves in not being African. And so the outside world interacts with us on that basis.
Yeah.
They come to us not to learn our ways because we ourselves don't care about our ways. We are still caught up in trying to mimic them.
Yeah.
Whereas everybody else has moved into saying, you want to come and do business in my country, you learn my culture, you learn my ways of doing things, and that's how it's going to be. And the rest of the world is adjusted to that. The rest of the world, similarly, is adjusted to the fact that we want to run away from ourselves.
On the note of running away from ourselves, one of the themes that has come up, Zamafuza, is around role modeling. Yes. Again, a young person on the panel, if we're going to be talking about role modeling, we're talking about the Zamafuzes of today and the Zamafuzes of tomorrow. How easy or difficult is it for you as a young person to embrace this challenge of really being the agent or the variable that's going to change the mindset of younger Africans after you?
I think there are a number of myths that we need to start breaking, right? And with all due respect, the first myth is in looking at what our panel actually looks like right now. Right. And let's be very honest about that. And this is a true...
we thought you were equal to the three of us.
We're all born equal, some more than others, right? That's the first thing that we need to break. There are a number of others that really, and speaking to what Terence was talking about, the issues that young leaders face, there are a number of other things that we need to start thinking about and that I myself, in my position and the work that I do, think about deeply. And that's around how do we work actively to shift mindsets about how we perceive ourselves, others, and our environments. And how do we start navigating the relationships between those entities, right? Because when I think, for instance, I'll give myself as an example. When I look at my own history, until such time I was given the right experience of exposure, right? I never imagined a different future for myself at all. For me, one of those key markers was when I was able to get an opportunity to become a Mandela Rhodes Scholar, which had a really significant contribution to my leadership development. So that's one, And I think the second is really about thinking more deeply about what are the possibilities that we can try to reimagine of ourselves in what I mentioned earlier, and that's the self, the others, and the environment within which that we live and work, etc. And back to your question about how I've thought about that, and that's been about being able to immerse yourself in experiences that provide you with the practical tools that you need to negotiate those spaces, right? So again, I'll give another example. There were a number of experiences, exposure, and support that I've been exposed to over the past few years, right? And I'll give you one example of, I did a fellowship in the US, and it was with 25 young Africans. Fantastic that we were at a prestigious, university. However, most of the learning that actually took place was around the kitchen table. It was around the common room areas where we sat down and we spoke about issues that we experienced and spoke through solutions that we were trying to create, right? What it did is that it started making me think really differently about, what South Africa is and the issues that we face. And I started thinking more broadly about, but what are African problems and what are African solutions, right? And then, the second part of that was encouraging collaboration. And also that is another big piece of how we've thought about leadership development at Minds. how do we start creating the right and strong networks for people to be able to tap into one another, right? So I'll give you a practical example of one of the things that we're doing.
Zam, I'm going to ask you to hold that practical example. We've got 4 minutes of show left, so I'll come back to you if we get an opportunity to get it. But I'm hearing you well. Exposure, tools, and support, and a combination of these are going to be the bedrock of what the investment actually needs to look like. I'd like to give an audience member 1 or 2 final questions. Oh my goodness, too many hands. I'll take the first question and I'll take that question in the middle. Sir, unless your question is 5 words or less, please go ahead. 5 words or less, very sharp and to the point.
My question is it particularly suited to Africa that a lot of people prefer to work for the private sector than government, where if you look at Southeast Asia...
Thank you very much. So private sector versus government, that is the core and the crux of the question. I appreciate that very much. Let's take the question here in the middle. Madam, please go ahead. Thank you very much. Can we get a second microphone to Madame, please? No, can I ask you to use the microphone? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. It actually links to what Zama would just reference and Victor's earlier point about the 4th Industrial Revolution. My question to Zama is, how are you going to ensure this particular mines program is going to ensure that you address the intersectionality of race, gender, class, culture, generations? Otherwise, it will not address the core of what you're trying to achieve.
Thank you very much, Madam. I appreciate it. There was a final question. I'm not taking new hands. There's a final question right here in the front. Can we very quickly get the microphone to the gentleman? Sir, please put up your hand so that they can see you. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for the platform. I speak from both academia, but I could ask my question in French, but I realized that this platform is talking about African development and African leadership, yet there are no French-speaking people around here. So, exciting as this platform is, what is the plan for mines to bridge the gap between Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, because ultimately development on the continent includes those segments. Thank you.
Amazing question. Thank you very much. So, quick reflection, if we can. Zama, I'm going to come back to you because I think the question directly at your feet. Bridging the gap between the various intersectionalities, is this something that's been thought about?
Yes, it has. And some of the ways in which we've thought about this is, so I'll take you 3 of our thinkings, right? The first is around what types of experiences do we create for the scholars. And those experiences in particular relate to full immersive workshops that we will be holding across the continent based on some of the key pillars that we've designed the program on, and we can have this conversation later. I'm just going to try to be quick.
Thank you very much.
The second part is around exposure, and a lot of that lies in thinking through the mentoring and coaching that we have in terms of how are we able to bring in private, public, and social sector leaders to be able to mentor and coach and assist these guys in the regional blocks where they'll be. The last part, is actually around the support. So how do we start facilitating greater access to these guys, to the right institutions, the right leaders, etc., and how do we leverage the relationships built, for instance, by the leaders of the actual foundation in doing that?
Thank you so much, Zama. Francis, private sector versus public sector, the preference from the question that we heard from the gentleman is that Africans want to be in the private sector.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, since most human beings, since the beginning of the human species, have been in the private sector. The question really is, how do we attract the right incentivized people with the right ethical backbone into the government sector? The idea is not for the public sector to be as big in size as the private sector. Frankly, it should be slim and strong and ethical. And the big challenge we have in Africa is that we seem, our country somehow seem to be allergic to ethical leadership.
So we have a minute left. So, Victor, I'm going to allow you to just weigh in. I'm going to ask you, Dr. Moyo, to close for us. Very quickly, just weigh in. Very relevant points raised here around bridging the history of colonialism, even from a language perspective in Africa. Your views on that, Victor?
Just travel. Go to these French-speaking countries. You'll find you can do business there, even if you don't speak French. But it will help if you learn a bit of French. opening yourself to influences, opening yourself to other experiences is the best thing you can ever do for yourself. Whether you're a leader, a student, a business person, closing yourself up is just going to close all the opportunities.
Dr. Moyo, in the audience, besides Nedbankers, we have Nedbankers who are scholars who are interested in this program. There are different private sector representatives here, and maybe even representatives from the public sector as well. A final message that as we walk through the doors of the auditorium, you want us to remember.
Yep. My final message would be, whatever you envision or imagine for your country or the continent in terms of the future, take it as your responsibility to create it and partner with similar-minded people and organizations to make it happen. Every single institution in history has been built that way.
Whatever you imagine for your country or your continent, it is your responsibility to make it happen. I don't think I could have closed this conversation on a better note. A very big thank you to my panelists for really robustly engaging and interrogating the case for investing in leadership development on the African continent to accelerate the journey towards economic integration and social cohesion. Thank you so much for tweeting and, of course, for watching. For myself, Nozi Pombanjwa, it's goodbye. Thank you very much.